Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's book launch. Very pleased to join you tonight. My name's Jasmine. I'm from Carcanet Press, for those of you who don't know. We are, of course, here to launch Gregory Woods' new collection, Records of an Incitement to Silence. It's his 6th Carcanet collection, so this is really exciting, and thank you all for being here with us. Greg is here, and we are going to hear from him very soon. We're also joined by Richard Scott, who is also a wonderful poet. His collection Soho is out with Faber. It was shortlisted for the Eliot, the Forward and the Costa Poetry Prizes. So if you don't know his work, definitely go and buy his collection from the Faber website. I will invite him on screen in just a moment, but before I do, I just want to point a couple of things out to you. So we'll be together for about an hour this evening. Obviously, we can't see you and you can't turn your cameras on, so please do find the chat box and say hello to us. Please do make sure that you've clicked all panelists and attendees so that we can all read each other's messages. Otherwise, the other guests might not be able to read your message when you say hello to us. So that would be great. One other thing to note is that while Greg is doing his reading for you, I'm going to be showing the text on screen. If it's not to your liking, just do have a play around with it. You should be able to reconfigure it to get it to the setup that will be best for you. I think, what else do I need to tell you? Okay, after Greg has read for us, Richard will come back on screen. They're going to have a little conversation first. Richard's going to put some questions to Gregory, but we would also like you to get involved in that conversation. So once you found the chat, as I can see Michael has done, thank you. Please also find another button which is called Q&A. Get your questions lined up for Gregory so that Richard can put them to him, and we can get you involved in the conversation later on. That would be really great. I'll remind you in the chat later on when it's coming up to time for the audience questions. And the last thing to say is that you will get an automatic email tomorrow with the discount code Inspire the Book. Thank you for paying to be here. We do really appreciate that. I'll put it in the chat for you now, but I know this is kind of happening quite quickly. So don't worry about it too much. You'll get an automatic email, and I'm here throughout the event. If you have any like technical problems, just put them in the chat for us. Okay. So I think that's all the like sort of administrative stuff out of the way. And we now will launch Greg's new collection. So I'm going to invite Richard on screen to join me and we'll begin.
Hi, Jasmine. Thank you so much for that lovely welcome to everyone. It's so nice to be here. My name is Richard Scott, and I'm really happy to be here to be launching Gregory's book and to be in conversation with him. So I'll introduce Gregory now and the collection, and then we'll hear from Gregory Woods. He'll read for us. Gregory Woods is the author of 6 poetry collections, all published by Carcanet, including We Have the Melon, which was hailed by Tom Gunn as a handbook of desire, an exquisite insight, rapid and rich. Other works include the influential and lauded Articulate Flesh, Male Homoeroticism and Modern Poetry, A History of Gay Literature, the Male Tradition, and Homintern, How Gay Culture Liberated the Modern World, all published by Yale University Press. Woods's poetry is rhapsodically and unapologetically queer, and has been a touchstone to me and many other queer writers. He has consistently, over the last 27 years, written into and expanded the space for same-sex desire and queerness in contemporary poetry and criticism. And we're here tonight to celebrate his 6th book of poetry, Records of an Incitement to Silence. A long sequence characterized by slim sonnets that speak to loneliness, the formation of memory, and the liminal and in-between spaces that accommodate desire. It's a book which is as erotic as it is introspective, full of missed connections, and yet also these resonant celebrations of the flesh. What little I remember of him is not enough to make a man, but more than does to populate the memory. The parts incriminate the whole, writes Woods in a characteristic fusion of eroticism and plaintiveness. And now we're going to hear from Gregory Woods.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I think you can hear me. Welcome to UNESCO City of Literature, Nottingham, which is where I'm speaking to you from. Thank you, Richard, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Jasmine, too. Indeed, I want to thank Michael Schmidt and the whole team at Carcanet for the work they've put into this book and for continuing to have faith in my work and to helping me show it to the world. I haven't had much use for my voice in the last 18 months, and so I'm hoping that it'll stand up to an hour's worth of talking to you. Well, anyway, we'll soon find out. I'm going to read for about 20 minutes from the book. I'll start with part of the title poem itself, called Records of an Incitement to Silence. The title poem is in 16 sections, and we won't have to put up with all of them. But it's, I guess you could call it dispatches from trouble zones around the world by some kind of correspondent who is also writing poetry. And the poetry is, I guess you could say, is the poems that later turn up in the rest of this book. So I'll read you some of the sections from that. Records of an Incitement to Silence. 1. I woke in the night and struggled to find the light switch, my glasses, a pen. I wrote, "It was as if all sounds and smells were smells and sounds of you." I kept looking back. Did I not want to leave? Did I already regret the journey I was embarking on? Did I fear I would never pass this way again? Was I expecting someone to appear on the quayside, to wave me away or call me back? I wrote only sonnets. They seemed to fit the shape of my complaint. 3. For several years, I lived in a city in the south. Its people had a reputation for great warmth. The climate of the Gulf it clings to had given them every reason to be open-hearted and optimistic. The furtive corruption of their officials went unremarked. There was a uniformed guard with a submachine gun at the door of every bank. All was for the best. In those days, we were young. What we learned of the world, we thought we were creating. We often looked for ourselves in mirrors. We tested our edges against other surfaces. 7. Back in my hotel room, I sat at the desk and started a poem, writing on hotel-headed notepaper with the free hotel pen. Forgetfulness prevails in these contested forests. But I was hungry and dirty. I ordered some sandwiches from room service. When the boy delivered them, I was freshly showered, wearing only a towel. We gaped at each other, but missed the connection. I ate in front of the television. I felt I was in the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong life. One night, a policeman asked me not who I was, but who I thought I was. It was as if he knew better. I showed him my papers, but he seemed unconvinced. 10. The priest had none of the complacency of his tribe. His face was scored with anguish. Maybe he had just taken one of those confessions you hear of, a murder or the rape of a child, not yet committed, but about to be, and was being gnawed from within by the rat indiscretion. Or perhaps, poor fellow, He had simply heard that his mother had died. And the last section in this poem, 16. I often spent an evening walking out along the road beyond the edge of town. My only company, a thoughtful dog I'd given shelter during the bombardment and now could talk to since we shared a past. We often walked along the railway line as if to catch a scent of somewhere else, some distant terminus with no beyond, a feast of spice and liquefying loins. Content to speculate, we'd sniff the air with equal appetite, but no resolve. Reliant on each other's cunning, we imagined other possibilities, a trail of other scents to other ends. In those days, nobody believed in love. Sorry, I've lost my place. In those days, nobody believed in love. Its inconvenience disrupted systems, and its sublime expression tore the sheets. We thought ourselves objectively immune. The only body that remained to me was hers, the dog's. Her warmth, her hunger, and the way she kicked my ribs while having nightmares. She listened when I read my poetry, but seemed to like it better when I stopped. The book is essentially a sonnet sequence, an interrupted sonnet sequence, and its spine consists of, I think, 65 short sonnets. They're 14 lines, but the lines are short ones. They're in iambic trimeter, so 6 or 7 syllables instead of 10 or 11. I'm going to read you, I think, 6 of those sonnets. I'll read them straight off. I don't think I need to interrupt myself to describe any of them or explain them. An immigrant. We met each other in reflection, side by side. While I was waiting, he was being shaved, and when he'd paid, he stared at me before he left the shop. The barber called him yet another immigrant. I found him in the bar and took him up to where I lived. He turned away to strip. His anecdotes were innocent, and his erection smelt of soap. City of Love. You left the city. I decided to stay on. The faces were familiar, the buildings even more so. It was as if all sounds and smells were smells and sounds of you. The trams, the sirens, drunken laughter, breaking glass. I'd not have been surprised, revisiting the bench where we first met, to find a label screwed to it. The British poet Woods ejaculated here. Of interest. His private life is there for anyone to spy on. A teacup to the wall is accurate enough. Surveillance cameras follow him through the streets and squares, and mongrels sniff his boots for signs of where he's been. Who would have thought, and who but someone with a grudge, that such a man deserved such curiosity? When did humanity itself become a crime? To arms. At last the heat has been defeated by this drizzle, continuous and silent, and we can bear to touch each other once again. We peel each other out of sweaty clothes and waste no time on pleasantries. You grab my cock, abrupt with fierce determination, as if to take up arms in an emergency. The handle of a sword shaped to the hero's grip. My shame. Restore to me my rib of femininity, dear tyrant of a god, and I shall give you back your blessed apple, core and flesh and tawny skin. Unburn my witches and unburden my Madonnas. Abandon me to where you first abandoned me, but let me keep my shame. Give alms to mollify my blistered hands and knees, but let me keep my shame. Okay, one of the interruptions to the sonnet sequence is a long poem called No Title Yet, which is a sort of parodic English country house narrative. And it's written in two completely incompatible meters, alternating lines of iambic pentameter, which is the kind of stately measure of Shakespearean tragedy, and what is it? Dactylic trimeter, which is really a comic measure. Anyway, it's about a weekend in a country house where everybody talks too much but has nothing to say. And there's a sexual event in the middle of it, which I'll read you that part of it. Don't worry, it's not so explicit that it'll frighten the horses. And yeah, well, anyway, there we go. As they say on University Challenge, let's get on with it. Whom should I meet in the corridor but Slingsby Isinglass, the eldest son, heir to the earldom, but free as a serenely cageless bird, no title yet. Alcohol governed our destinies and what there was of my attractiveness. Slingsby had taken a drop or two. He looked me over with a breeder's eye, waving his standards to favor me. The moon that night was not the only thing Providence handled with negligence. He lunged at me unsteadily. He lurched. Knot came unknotted, and dressing gown swung open like the curtains on Act One. Manhood in selfish soliloquy, the focus of attention, center stage. Strutting and fretting like Peter overacting tools in Carnadine Macbeth. Used to the homage of speechlessness, he said what needed saying in one word. Here, he exhaled in my ear, as he reversed me through my bedroom door, tripped on the rug, and delivered me across the room, half crushed against his chest, Hercules lifting Antaeus to divorce him from the safety of the soil. Reader, imagine my diffident bewilderment at being clocked and plucked, not so much taken as buccaneered aback, all timbers shivered, buckles swashed. Coming to rest on the ottoman, he splayed his thews. Momentum did the rest, landing me slap in the wonderland between. The etiquette was understood. England expects, if you follow me. I duly did my patriotic duty. Sculpted by vigorous exercise, his torso all the tauter in repose, staggered my faint sensibilities, reducing me to licking it as if life had no more to be satisfied. The cat that got the cream, and more besides. Slippery ivory gleaming with concupiscent intelligence, the flesh knowingly grudging its promises. His organs of communication waxed profligate, gushingly lyrical while short on sense. The Adam's apple bobbed, much like a float when the hook has been mistaken for a glint of sustenance. Glottal and frottal, nonsensical tirades connected unconnected words, thalamus, calamus, salamis, that needed meaning as a kiss needs clothes. Even the blandest of blandishments came peppered with Tourette's. You'd want more than the Leipzig edition of Professor Freud's interpretation of dreams to make sense of his rudderless meanderings, assuming sense is what buys us our purchase on sanity. The voice was indistinct at times, but then, true to genetic inheritance, assumed the elocution of his ilk, razor-sharp consonants cutting through flamboyantly expressive vowels. Heedless of all his unbosomings, attending to that massive body's needs, laboring silently, as is my laconic wont, absorbed in venery. I, for my own part, was listening without commitment, absently involved, shaping an eloquent muteness to the thrust of his forthcoming coming forth. Came not the dawn, but the lack of it, and Slingsby Isinglass was fast asleep, snoring like Etna with adenoids. Not Gilgamesh bemoaned his Enkidu nearly as noisily, half as explosively. Endymion in moonlight never so prettily symbolized drowsiness. Yet I was left to crawl away to bed, dignified silence personified. I'll just read a couple more poems. There are two slightly fatter poems, which were commissioned by Nottingham Contemporary when they first opened to accompany a David Hockney exhibition. One of the sonnets is called a Hockney, but this one's called a bigger Hockney because it's fatter. A boy emerges from each ostentatious splash, like mawkish baubles, water glinting on his lashes. The fault line holds, the air's alive with balderdash. If surfaces lack moral qualities, he thrashes the competition with his tan's banal panache, defeating anyone his nakedness abashes. He executes a belly flop that rips a gash across the canvas. The computer network crashes. We leave deposits of desire like stolen cash in random and neglectfully forgotten stashes. His navel gushes chlorine, but his backside, brash and trashy, hoards the energy of lightning flashes. A sunset steals across the smog screen like a rash, and dusk subdues itself from melanin to ashes. Then finally, I'll read a poem which is, I suppose, an elegy. It's called Dream Midnight. I don't think I need to explain it. At midnight, one midnight in 72, I wandered the city with nothing to do. I wandered the city as if I were dreaming, the blood in my temples insistently drumming. The doing of nothing took most of the night, so slow was my progress downwind of the light. So slow was my progress, I thought I was dreaming, the blood in my temples insistently drumming. With nothing to guide me or show me my way, I knew where I was as if walking by day. I knew where I was, but I must have been dreaming, the blood in my temples insistently drumming. As if an idea had a substance to clutch, I might have been holding you, warm to the touch. I might have been holding you rather than dreaming, the blood in my temples insistently drumming. Bewildered by doubt as my fancy became, I thought I could hear you saying my name. I thought I could hear you, but I was dreaming, the blood in my temples insistently drumming. In separate places and separate hearts, We blended our voices, exact counterparts. We blended our voices into our dreaming, the blood in our temples insistently drumming. Our throats made the sounds of the pleasures they lacked, unspeakable vices delivered from tact, unspeakable vices of which we were dreaming, the blood in our temples insistently drumming. At midnight, one midnight, a long time ago, I wrote you these verses, but you didn't know. I wrote you these verses as if you were dreaming, the blood in your temples insistently drumming.
That was such a beautiful reading. Thank you so much, Gregory. It's so beautiful to hear those poems. So we're going to have a conversation now, and while we do, if there's any kind of burning questions that you want to put to Gregory, please write them in the chat or write them in the Q&A box, and in a little while I'll be able to ask them. Gregory, I love that line. I wrote only sonnets. They seem to fit the shape of my complaints. Tell me about these slim sonnets. To me, they seem in a way like wonderfully queer, sort of chipping at or eroding at the sense of maybe a sort of normal sonnet, you know, being some 84 syllables instead of the more expected 140. How did the form suggest itself to you?
Well, first of all, you talk of the normal sonnet. There ain't no such thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the sonnet has been queer for centuries, though obviously not exclusively so by any means, but it has been a form that has been eminently usable by the likes of Michelangelo and Shakespeare, and who am I to disagree with them? But it is also nowadays, I saw some really insulting stuff about sonnets somewhere online only yesterday. It is regarded as being a stuffy old form that represents everything that is dreadful about traditionalist poetry. And that in itself rather attracts me to it, because I'm kind of resistant to people's unthinking prejudices. But yes, I mean, there are times when you want to shave off the more stilted aspects of it. There are times when you don't need or want rhyme. I mean, there are some rhyming sonnets, as we've just seen one of them this evening, but there are other rhyming sonnets in this book. But sometimes you just want to get something much briefer down. I don't know what started that mood. I think it was a retrospective mood where I was trying to capture moments from the past. And I had done those in my first two collections, in We Have the Melon and May I Say Nothing, in little syllabic 12-line poems in I think 3 stanzas, or was it 4 stanzas? Can't remember. But I like the argumentative shape of the sonnet, with the octave and then the sestet, the 8 lines and then the 6 lines. There's something about that imbalance that works very well for me. And so I don't think of breaking them down, breaking the sonnet down as being intrinsically queer. I don't think. But I did want to do something, well, I couldn't help doing something queer with them. I don't feel that I particularly have a choice about that.
I love what you're talking about, this kind of shaving away to kind of to reveal something and reveal the more usefulness in the form. And I also really enjoy what you're talking about as sort of writing into the queer tradition of the sonnet. That feels very apt. And what you touched upon there, the shorter lines of the tercets that you used in We Have the Melon, I felt that that was very much present in this collection as well, almost as if you've kind of come full circle or something. Were you sort of consciously talking back to those early poems?
Not directly, but sure, they are there in the background, I guess. I think probably I wasn't aware of how close I was coming. I knew that some of the topics date from the same period. Some of the moods date from the same periods of those earlier ones, and so I knew that thematically they were connecting up. There's something odd going on in my poetry. I find it difficult to look back over the 6 collections, and indeed further. I think I'd written, I mean, I was something like 38 when We Have the Melon was published. I'd written certainly 2 collections before that, and eventually thrown them both away. I've always suspected since then that they were probably rather good, but what the hell? It doesn't really matter. I don't think I've ever particularly regretted them, because I knew that I wanted to throw them away at the time. But I mean, I do think of myself as a kind of late modernist, as someone who, like figures like Auden or Eliot, are using traditional form and breaking it up and playing with it. Or I don't really like the idea of play in this context, because I'm doing something that I take more seriously really than play. But oddly enough, I've been kind of moving in the wrong direction towards more fixed forms, rather than away from them in the way that most modernists worked. I do long to write a book full of only free verse, but that hasn't happened yet, because I do still love writing the kinds of poems that I can write, and that includes metrical and rhyming and all sorts of other forms. Though most of my collections have had more variation within them than this one.
It's lovely that you mentioned Auden, but I actually wanted to ask you about sort of the influence of Cavafy potentially, because for me, I feel like Cavafy is really sort of present in this book almost. Certainly in some of the poems which are very sort of frankly erotic. I'm thinking about the sandwich delivery guy in the hotel, for instance, with the missed connection. And I just wondered if you felt Cavafy's influence.
How could one not? I mean, I've read Cavafy so much, and I have, you know, God knows, about 30 volumes of Cavafy across the other side of this room. I think actually perhaps as I get older, I find myself getting more in tune with him, in part because my mood becomes more downbeat and more elegiac, somewhat less celebratory of sex, I think. I'm not sure, but certainly I think this collection has more explicit reference to loneliness than previous ones. And that isn't just because I'm publishing it after 18 months of living in my house on my own. because actually most of this collection was written, in fact, all but 2 of the poems in this collection were written before the COVID pandemic. But yeah, I mean, also the connection that Cavafy makes between his own sexual life or his own sexual longings in Alexandria in the 20th century and classical and post-classical Greek cultures in the Greek diaspora around the Balkans and the Levant. That kind of connection with history is something that I've been doing, I think, all the way through my published poetry career. Again, that's something that tends to get attacked by some modern gay or queer readers, because they think of it as being this sort of old-fashioned homosexual longing for statuesque Greek boys. But actually, I think in most of my references to Greece and Rome, I'm very critical of the kinds of masculinity and the kinds of objectification of slaves and so on, implicitly between the lines, I mean, or explicitly. There are poems about Alexander the Great in one of my collections, I can't remember which are really, they're kind of sexy poems, but they are also pointing out that he was a mass murderer, which does seem to me to be relevant. It's not irrelevant to his sexiness, but it also feeds into a much more complex idea of what sex involves, and the kinds of degrees of usage of people and the degrees of humiliation and shame and all that sort of stuff that are involved, not just in the sexual life of major international conquerors, but also me and the boy next door.
You mentioned loneliness, which I think is a real theme in this collection. There's a line in the poem Visible, which I really like. When he goes home to bed, elated to have stood where thousands stood, yet to have filled their empty space, his nakedness absorbs the introspective darkness. And I thought that really perfectly captured the sense of the single solo body in contrast with the many others that potentially roam a cityscape. And it's so interesting because the city here, it's a place of, in your poems in this collection, it's a place of eroticism, but also of kind of aching loneliness that seems to go hand in hand.
Yes, I think there's a mirroring poem among those ones that start with the same line. There's a mirroring one where his naked body is associated with other naked bodies, whereas this one is almost made to be a solo body. Yes, I mean, I think all the way through my poetry, desire operates as much in isolation as it does à deux or in a crowd. That we're talking here not just about, I mean, we're not just talking about sexy sexual acts, we're talking about sexy thoughts and the sexiness of the imagination and the way that we experience not only other bodies, but physical spaces, the physical spaces of these rooms that there are so many of in this book. There are so many references to unmade beds, to rumpled sheets, torn sheets. Now these are torn by people on their own or by people together. or by sheer force of the imagination. The imagination is what's operating behind the creation of the poems, and either triggering itself and creating other bodies or triggered by other bodies. And the poems on loneliness, as far as I can remember, are always reflecting on other people. And not just, oh dear, I wish there was someone else here, but in a much more sophisticated way.
Yeah, of course.
And also, of course, there are dogs there as well. I don't own a dog, but there are dogs in all of my poetry books. And there's something there that I don't really understand. I didn't realize until about my 5th collection that the poems are full of dogs. And somebody else, some critic or some psychoanalyst, needs to work out what they're doing there. But it is related to related to finding, perhaps sometimes related to finding somebody easier to connect with than other people. So not just a replacement for an absent loved one, but something else. I don't know. Woof woof.
I think when people read the collection through in its entirety, they'll get a real sense of the power of these repeated lines that really thread themselves through the collection. It may not have been immediately apparent from your reading, but there are these lines that sort of keep coming back. I'm thinking about lines like "He walks around the city at night," which appears in several poems. And
there are 6 of those, yeah.
6, exactly. And this device of the repeated line I thought was so interesting, because in a way it sort of perfectly evoked a kind of restless and lonely mind, sort of trying to make sense of their surroundings, or to make something new, to make a new piece of art in response to the feelings of anxiety and loneliness.
Yes, and they're part of the atmosphere around one's head, inside and outside. In the long poem that I extracted, there's that line thalamus, calamus, salamis, and or maybe not in that order, which are end words from rhyme words from one of the other poems. They are constantly fussing around each other, these poems, and referring to each other, and unmaking each other or adding to each other, in rather, I think, nervous ways, perhaps. I was almost going to say fussy ways, but fussy is not quite the word I mean. But you're right. Yeah, it's important that I do think this. Well, I think this is true of all my collections. I think of it very much as a collection rather than individual poems. And in my own reading life, I hardly ever read individual poems. I tend not to read poetry magazines. I tend to read poetry collections, and I read them from front cover to back cover. I tend not to understand individual poems, or there's something I have some kind of blockage. It's not that I'm reading poetry collections as a narrative, but I somehow want to get more meat out of that poet, and to see how this poem contrasts with that other one. So I suppose I do read collections as if all the poems are connected. And in this book, I tried to arrange the poems as if there was, you could rearrange these poems and make a much clearer sense of a narrative building up. And I really didn't want that. I don't object to people reading them as a narrative, but I didn't want to arrange them in that way myself. So there are often some very abrupt cuts between the poems as you go from topic to topic. There doesn't seem to be any immediate logic to it. but by the time you've read your way through from the front cover to the back, I hope that then a kind of unity it comes through that is aided by the tension between the different poems.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you a little bit about these liminal spaces that really seem to characterize the book for me. You write the sequestered place between the railway line and the phlegmatic sea. And it really does seem that the book is a sort of travelogue of in-between places that are either kind of being used potentially for cruising or sort of desirous purposes, or to evoke a kind of, like we've been talking about, a kind of loneliness, a feeling of being ill at ease, a feeling of not quite belonging.
Yes, there are spaces like that in An Ordinary Dog as well, my last collection, which came out 10 years ago. Yes, sort of scrublands, and I do love railway lines apart from anything else, but this collection was written while I was researching Homintern, the book that Yale published in 2016, Homintern, How Gay Culture Liberated the Modern World. And that's a book about lesbian and gay internationalism and about travel. It's essentially a travel book. And I think to the same extent, this is a piece of travel writing. It refers back to places I've been to, but it's also places I go to in my imagination. I travel a lot sitting at my desk here. I spent part of this afternoon driving into Tunis on Google Street View. I drove into Tunis on the top end of the Trans-African Highway, and then found my way into smaller and smaller streets, and was looking at the strange nondescript people you see on Street View. They all have blurry faces, as if they're turning away from you. And yeah, you're right to identify a lot of these spaces as, I mean, I do when I visit cities I don't know, I tend to turn off the beaten track very quickly. And also, in the past, I have tended to do a lot of my tourism at night. So not just cruising, but also just looking at cities. I love them at night. I also love them in the fog, so that you threaten to get lost. I never have a mobile phone. I don't possess one, but I do tend to take a map with me just in case. But this idea that you may be moving away from the center of activity, the center of a city's fame, the center of its wealth, and finding much more interesting life going on in peculiar corners by rental garages and out behind by the bins and things like that. Beautiful spaces.
Peculiar corners by rental garages and out by the bins. That's a beautiful line for your next book, I think. Well, some people have asked some questions in the Q&A, so I will ask you a couple of these if that's okay.
Of course it is, yes.
John has asked, could you say something about how you use form and especially rhyme? What draws you to using rhyme?
The simplest answer to that is pleasure. It's the pleasure of chewing over words before they have meaning. I quite often choose a rhyme scheme before writing the poem. I use a rhyming dictionary quite a lot. I know there are a lot of people who think that's cheating, which seems to me very strange. The same as people don't think, People have told me in the past that you shouldn't use a thesaurus when writing poetry. Well, okay, if you want your poetry always to be completely off the cuff, then good luck to you. But that's not the way I write. But yeah, it's something to do with the pleasure in the sound of words, and it goes back to my childhood. I was thinking just recently of, and this isn't necessarily about rhyme, but just about the pleasure of words. I was thinking about words that had given me pleasure when I was a small child. Fujiyama. The Olympics reminded me of Fujiyama, which I first read about in a children's encyclopedia. Aurora Borealis. I mean, these are just extraordinary words that then have an image attached to them, and that you can then turn into other words or fold into other words, and by rhyming them, half rhyming them, or whatever. It's to do with the sensual pleasure of using language, with or without meaning. I'm perfectly happy to not admit, but affirm that some of my most successful rhyming poetry is poetry that doesn't have great depth of meaning, of kind of logical meaning, but it has, to me, great depth of emotion. And of almost physical sensuality. So one of the things, I mean, it would distress me to have to get rid of rhyme and meter, because it seems to me that they are, even if you're moving in and out of them within the same poem, that you're actually intrinsically celebrating one of the things that is most extraordinary about human beings. Mm-hmm. And that's the relationship between our tongues and our minds.
And Michael is asking about diction as well. So Michael's asking, there were elements in the diction which seem to tie into some of the histories and etymologies explored in Articulate Flesh, Mollify, for example, and others he heard. So are you moving towards a kind of historically queer or queered diction?
I suspect that my daily diction is itself historical, because I tend to use all these words in everyday speech anyway, if I remember them. I'm not sure about Articulate Flesh. Articulate Flesh is currently being translated into Portuguese suddenly after however many years. That was first published in '87. Which produces a particular kind of pleasure. Yeah, I'm aware of the history of a lot of the language I use. I used quite a lot of Latinate words, for instance, still, partly because I was a literary academic, and a lot of the words that you use as an academic are the Latinate words, and also I then reused them when I was teaching in Italy, but in their Italian versions. I learned Latin at school, and also I was a Roman Catholic at that age, and that was before the Mass, the Latin Mass was abandoned. So I'm to an extent conscious of the history of the words I'm using, not in any kind of doctrinaire or academic way. I'm not particularly interested. I've got a wonderful etymological dictionary downstairs, but I hardly ever use it. It cost me a fortune. But yes, I mean, it is important to me that I can hear. Again, it comes to internationalism and my fervent anti-Brexitism. But it is important to me to hear the French in our language, and the Latin or Italian and so forth. the German, and my family, more than a couple of generations back, is largely French, Italian, and German, and so, you know, I see no point in cutting ourselves off from the past. I'm not one of these people who believes that everything should be absolutely 21st century. The way that advertisers are always using the phrase 21st century, it doesn't seem to me to be a great recommendation. You know, it's fine, we're in the 21st century, but we have a few others to feed off as well.
And another question from the Q&A. Greg, do you share your actual love poems, not the satires, with their subjects? Which is a kind of interesting question there. Do you share your love poems with people?
Well, that I have done, yes, but that's not their primary purpose. I'm kind of reluctant to discuss that. Now, why am I kind of reluctant to discuss that? Partly because I don't want them to be attached to a particular narrative between me and him. And so the love poems tend not to be dedicated to an individual. I'm not a lot of the poems are dedicated to individuals, but I don't really want to, as it were, publicly tie them to particular individuals. Some of them, of course, are not to particular individuals. Some of them are just love poems to love poetry or to imagined individuals. And I don't particularly want my biography to restrict the range of any particular poems. So that may be why I tend not to do what Auden did, which was prolifically dedicate poems to his lovers.
It made me think a little bit of that line from your poem Of Interest. His private life is there for anyone to spy on. But that in turn also made me think a little bit about how that poem moves on to a teacup to the wall, surveillance cameras follow him through the streets and squares. That also made me think a little bit about how the city has really changed in the past 2 decades. It's become potentially less of a place for desirous exploration and a more sort of gentrified, spied on space.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And also people using their mobile devices to find each other as well, which changes the use of space, I think. I mean, I don't use one, so I don't really know how that works, but it does seem to me that walking out of a building and going down a street at night with desirous intent, says he pompously, but with a clean sheet, with no mobile or anything, just kind of thinking, now where are the likely spaces? Oh, I know, the little park in front of the railway station. That always works, especially if there are public lavatories there. That aspect of cities, yes, you're right, is being patrolled and cleaned up. That's why I suppose what I was saying earlier about the spaces behind the bins resonates more and more, I think, because there are those privately owned spaces around office buildings and so on with security guards and
yeah, absolutely,
all that stuff.
Well, we're coming to the end of the event. I'm just going to ask one more question because we've got another question in the Q&A. I wish we could keep on talking forever about bins and poems. But I'll just ask one more question, which I think is quite interesting because you were talking about not having a mobile phone, not using that device. But a question from G is, Greg, you regularly post beautiful art and architecture images and brief book reviews on Facebook. Has your participation in social media affected your poetry writing or thinking in any way? So I guess this would be kind of, has social media and digital sort of world via a computer affected your poetry?
It hasn't literally, in the sense that I don't write on screen. I write on paper my prose as well as my verse. I find that that's well, it's the way I think. I'm not sure that it has. I tend not to post poems online until after they've been published, partly because I'm not yet secure in the idea that they're any good. One of the things about my use of Facebook in the last couple of years is that I've been reduced to silence, and that's why I've been posting pictures 3 a day for a year and a half or more, I think. So about 1,500 of these things, of sculpture and paintings and buildings, because I was so horrified by Trumpism and by Brexit, and then of course by COVID-19. And I felt that one was expected to contribute to discussion, no, not to discussion. One was expected to throw in the occasional sentence, deploring this or deploring that, and swearing about this and swearing about that. And I really didn't feel I could do anything that was different from anyone else, or that contributed to any kind of coherent discussion. And I felt reduced to silence by that. And I've not actually written much poetry in the last year. But I think in speaking in general terms, I don't think that the writing of my poetry has been fundamentally affected by social media, in part just because I only go online when I'm sitting at my PC, as I am now, which means I'm not always online, instantly responding to things. And I'm still, when I'm writing, I don't have my computer on. So I'm not connected. I'm sure there must be ways in which it's affected my writing, but not in ways that I'm conscious of.
It makes me think of that line in your poem Memento. What he so tenderly consults is a remembered landscape. The man kisses the picture of the landscape from his wallet when the speaker kisses the picture. But it would be a real physical picture as opposed to an online picture.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to, I'm being told via the chat that we have to draw things to a close. I mean, it's been such a pleasure chatting to you, Gregory, and congratulations.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Richard, very much indeed for taking part in this. I've really enjoyed this, and I reiterate what Jasmine said, that people should go out and buy your book, Soho, published by Faber. It's a brilliant book.
Well, thank you. That means such a lot. Thank you, Gregory.
As well as buying Soho from the Faber website, you should perhaps even first and foremost visit our own website, and buy Greg's wonderful new book. I've put the link in the chat for you again. You use the code there and you'll get your £2 discount, but check your emails tomorrow if you can't do that right now. You'll get the code there, and get in touch if you have any problems with that. So yeah, there it is in all its glory. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you, Gregory, for your just beautiful readings. It was so good to hear you chat about this book. I kind of can't believe it's been an hour already, like I wanted to go on and on. So yeah, thank you so much, and congratulations, Gregory. It's been really, really great. Thank you guys for being here and for all your messages in the chat. I'll leave it open for a moment so you can get your final messages in there. So the last thing for me to say is please do join us again. Our next launch is on August the 11th. We will be launching a debut collection by Pawana Fayaz, 40 Names. She has previously won a Forward Prize for Best Single Poem, and that poem is in the book, so it's going to be really exciting. She'll be joined by Adrian Poole, and they'll be talking about the book. So check the website out, buy the book, please, and join us again next time. So that's everything from us. Thank you very much, guys, and good night.